By the 1st century BCE, Britain occupied a paradoxical position within the Roman world. It lay beyond the formal boundaries of the empire, separated from the European mainland by the Channel, yet it was neither unknown nor irrelevant. Roman merchants, diplomats, and military observers were already familiar with its coastline, resources, and internal geography. This familiarity did not arise from conquest, but from sustained economic contact and strategic observation. Britain's physical environment shaped how it was settled, how it was exploited, and how it would later be approached by Roman power. The island's geography imposed both isolation and accessibility. Britain was separated from Gaul by less than 40 kilometers at its narrowest point, allowing maritime contact to remain feasible even with Iron Age technology. Archaeological evidence from coastal sites indicates sustained cross-channel movement of goods and people well before the Roman invasion. At the same time, Britain's insular nature limited large-scale political integration, contributing to regional autonomy and uneven development across the island. Climatically, late Iron Age Britain experienced relatively stable conditions compared to earlier prehistoric periods. Pollen core samples from southern and eastern England indicate widespread forest clearance beginning in the mid-1st millennium BCE, reflecting increased agricultural activity. Mixed farming dominated, with cereals such as barley and wheat cultivated alongside pastoral systems focused on cattle and sheep. These patterns suggest a landscape increasingly shaped by human intervention, particularly in lowland regions with fertile soils. Britain's river systems played a critical role in structuring settlement and economic activity. Rivers such as the Thames, Severn, Trent, and Humber functioned as natural transport corridors, enabling movement of goods and people across otherwise difficult terrain. Excavations along these waterways revealed dense clusters of settlements, storage facilities, and ritual deposits, indicating their importance not only for subsistence but also for communication and trade. Control of river valleys often corresponded to regional political influence among Iron Age groups. In contrast, upland regions such as Wales, northern England, and parts of Scotland presented different environmental constraints. Thinner soils, higher rainfall, and rugged terrain limited intensive agriculture, encouraging dispersed settlement patterns and pastoral economies. Hill forts in these regions were often positioned to control access routes rather than arable land, suggesting that geography directly influenced defensive priorities and social organization. These regional contrasts would later shape Roman military strategy and administrative division. Britain's mineral resources formed another defining feature of its environmental profile. Classical sources, including Strabo and later Pliny the Elder, reference Britain's abundance of metals, particularly tin, which was essential for bronze production. Archaeological evidence from Cornwall and Devon confirms long-term tin extraction and export, likely integrated into Atlantic trade networks. Lead and silver deposits in areas such as the Mendip Hills and Wales further enhanced Britain's economic significance from a Mediterranean perspective. These mineral resources were not evenly distributed, reinforcing regional specialization. Areas rich in metals often developed trade-oriented economies, while agriculturally productive zones supported higher population densities. Coin finds and imported goods indicate that southeastern Britain, in particular, was deeply connected to continental markets by the 1st century BCE. Amphora fragments and fine pottery from Gaul attest to sustained exchange, even in the absence of Roman political control. Settlement density in Britain reflected these environmental variables. Archaeological surveys show concentrated populations in fertile lowlands, especially in regions later associated with major tribal groupings such as the Cativalani and Trinovants. Oppida sites like Camulogenum demonstrate proto-urban characteristics, including planned layouts, defensive earthworks, and evidence of craft production. These developments suggest that environmental advantages supported increasing social complexity. At the same time, Britain lacked the infrastructural integration seen in Mediterranean regions. There were no paved roads, standardized urban grids, or centralized water systems prior to Roman rule. Movement across the landscape depended on natural routes shaped by terrain and waterways. This absence of large-scale infrastructure limited political consolidation, reinforcing local autonomy and regional identities. Environmental constraints also affected communication and control. Dense forests, marshlands, and river crossings created natural boundaries between communities. Roman military commentators later noted the difficulty of moving large forces through Britain's interior, a challenge that had shaped indigenous political structures long before Roman involvement. Geography did not merely influence settlement. It structured power itself. Archaeological evidence from landscape surveys further illustrates how land was used and managed. Field systems identified through aerial photography reveal organized agricultural planning in some regions, while other areas retained more flexible, seasonal patterns of land use. These differences suggest that Britain contained multiple economic models operating simultaneously, shaped by local environmental conditions rather than centralized authority. The insular environment also influenced Britain's relationship with external powers. Maritime access facilitated trade but limited rapid military intervention. Prior to the Roman invasion, Britain could engage with continental Europe while remaining politically independent. This balance allowed local elites to benefit from exchange without surrendering autonomy, a situation that would change decisively after 43 CE. Roman strategic interest in Britain cannot be understood without reference to these environmental factors. Agricultural potential, mineral wealth, and navigable waterways made the island economically attractive, while its fragmented geography reduced the likelihood of unified resistance. At the same time, difficult terrain and variable climates posed logistical challenges that delayed conquest for nearly a century after Caesar's expeditions. By the late Iron Age, Britain was neither a marginal wilderness nor a fully integrated economic partner. It was a complex landscape shaped by environmental diversity, regional specialization, and long-term human adaptation. These conditions framed every subsequent interaction between Britain and Rome, influencing how the island would be invaded, governed, and ultimately transformed. As Roman observers increasingly documented Britain's terrain, resources, and settlement patterns, environmental knowledge became a prerequisite for political and military action. Geography had already determined where people lived, how they farmed, and how they traded. It would soon determine how Rome imposed authority across the island. Geography shaped not only settlement patterns, but also the social structures that emerged across Iron Age Britain. Before we continue exploring the landscapes that shaped Britain, make sure to hit the subscribe button and click the bell icon to catch a new Nightfall history video every day. Also, let us know in the comments which part of Britain's pre-Roman world you found most intriguing so far. Britain before Rome was not unified, but it was far from politically static. Across the island, a patchwork of tribal societies maintained complex, regionally specific structures of authority. These societies were organized primarily around kinship and lineage, with power vested in local elites who controlled land, trade, and military forces. Classical sources, including Julius Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico and later Tacitus, provide the first written descriptions of these tribes, although Roman accounts often reflect external perspectives shaped by strategic interests. Archaeology, however, confirms that the social and political organization of Iron Age Britain was highly differentiated and regionally nuanced. The southern and eastern regions of Britain were densely populated relative to the uplands of Wales, northern England, and parts of Scotland. The Trinovants and Catavallani, for example, controlled fertile lowlands in southeastern Britain. Evidence from coinage, hill fort distributions, and oppida demonstrates that these groups exercised centralized control over economic resources, while also maintaining regional alliances with smaller neighboring tribes. Numismatic studies, particularly of coins bearing rulers' names such as Tatiovanus and Cunobellinus, indicate dynastic authority and the emergence of elite display through material culture. These coins not only circulated locally but also served as markers of legitimacy in trade relations extending across the Channel into Gaul. In contrast, northern and western tribes such as the Brigantes and Ordovices inhabited less fertile, more geographically challenging terrain. Settlement patterns in these areas were sparser, with hill forts positioned strategically to control movement rather than agricultural output. Archaeological surveys reveal that these hill forts were not merely defensive structures. They functioned as political centers, marketplaces, and symbols of elite status. Their construction required coordinated labor, suggesting the presence of organized leadership capable of mobilizing and managing populations over extended periods. At sites such as Stanwick and Maiden Castle, ramparts and ditches demonstrate both military planning and social hierarchy, confirming that these tribes were capable of sustained, large-scale organization despite the absence of a centralized state. Proto-urban development is particularly evident in southern Opida such as Camulogenum, later Colchester. Excavations reveal planned layouts, defensive earthworks, and evidence of craft specialization and long-distance trade. Imported pottery and metalwork attest to interactions with continental Europe, highlighting how trade networks reinforce the social and political influence of local elites. In some cases, elite residences were deliberately situated within fortified centers, combining defense with displays of wealth and status. These patterns suggest a form of political centralization at a local or regional level, distinct from the hierarchical state models familiar to Rome, but sufficient to organize labor, control resources, and engage in diplomacy. The Iceni of modern-day Norfolk provide an illustrative example of the variability of tribal governance. Archaeological evidence indicates that the Iceni maintained relatively autonomous control over their territory, with leaders exercising authority over both land and trade, including the export of agricultural products. Inscriptions and later Roman accounts of the Iceni suggest that they could negotiate terms with Roman officials, highlighting the flexibility of tribal authority and the significance of kin-based leadership. Such arrangements allowed for localized autonomy while also providing avenues for interaction with external powers, whether in trade or diplomacy. Trade itself was a crucial factor in political power. Many elites controlled not only land but also the production and distribution of key goods, including metalwork, ceramics, and textiles. Coastal tribes participated in cross-channel exchange, importing wine, fine pottery, and luxury items from Gaul and the Rhineland. Archaeologists have uncovered imported amphorae and decorative objects in southern Britain, indicating both wealth accumulation and integration into continental networks. Control over trade routes strengthened tribal hierarchies and facilitated the consolidation of authority, reinforcing distinctions between elites and common populations. Despite these forms of regional centralization, Britain lacked a unified political structure. Each tribe operated independently, and alliances were often temporary or situational. Tribal boundaries were fluid, sometimes defined by natural features such as rivers or hills, and sometimes contested through conflict or negotiation. This fragmentation meant that Roman observers encountered a mosaic of political entities, each requiring separate consideration for conquest, diplomacy, or administration. The unevenness of power across the island would directly shape Roman military strategy, as legions faced resistance in some areas while encountering compliance or neutrality in others. Military organization within tribes reflected local conditions and available resources. Larger tribes, particularly in southern Britain, maintained warrior classes capable of coordinated action. Hill forts and oppida often served as mustering points, storage facilities, and logistical hubs. Weapons recovered from excavations, including iron swords, spears, and defensive armor, demonstrate technological capability sufficient to challenge incursions, but also variation in martial capacity between regions. Roman reconnaissance accounts noted these differences, with Caesar remarking on the disparate abilities and willingness of tribes to resist incursions during his expeditions. Leadership was closely tied to both social and economic authority. Tribal elites derived status from land control, the capacity to redistribute resources, and participation in regional trade networks. Archaeological evidence of monumental earthworks, imported goods, and coinage suggests that material display reinforced political legitimacy. Dynastic succession, evidenced in the continuity of elite names on coins and inscriptions, allowed for long-term maintenance of authority within certain regions. The ability to negotiate with external powers, particularly through gift exchange or tribute, further enhanced elite standing and facilitated the projection of influence beyond immediate territory. Ritual and religious practice also intersected with political organization. Sacred sites, ritual deposits, and ceremonial earthworks often coincided with hill forts and oppida, indicating that spiritual authority complemented secular leadership. Archaeologists have recovered votive offerings and evidence of communal ceremonies that reinforce social cohesion and the authority of ruling elites. This integration of religious practice and political control provided additional mechanisms for regulating society in the absence of centralized administrative structures. The combination of environmental constraints, economic control, and social hierarchy created a complex landscape of power that was recognizable but unfamiliar to Rome. Each tribe operated under its own rules and priorities, requiring careful observation and negotiation. Roman writers recognized both the sophistication and the fragmentation of these societies, noting that political power was locally grounded and often contested. Understanding these dynamics is essential to interpreting subsequent interactions between Britain and the Roman state, including strategies of conquest, occupation, and administration. By the late Iron Age, Britain presented a pattern of regional centralization within a broader framework of political fragmentation. Southern Oppida exhibited proto-urban complexity and trade integration, upland hill forts maintained defensive and symbolic authority, and coastal tribes engaged with continental networks while retaining autonomy. This heterogeneous political landscape provided both opportunities and challenges for Roman expansion. The variability of tribal power meant that conquest would proceed unevenly, with some regions assimilating rapidly while others resisted or negotiated terms of compliance. These fragmented societies soon entered the written record through Roman observation and intervention, setting the stage for the military campaigns and administrative strategies that would define the first century of imperial control. Knowledge of their political organization, settlement patterns, and regional hierarchies informed Roman decision-making and shaped the province that would ultimately emerge after the Claudian invasion. Britain first entered Roman history not through conquest, but reconnaissance. In 55 BCE, Julius Caesar undertook the first documented Roman expedition to the island, framed primarily as an exploratory mission to gather intelligence rather than to establish permanent control. The campaigns of 55 and 54 BCE, recorded in Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico, reveal strategic objectives focused on surveying the territory, assessing tribal alliances, and demonstrating Roman military reach. Caesar's attention to coastal topography, navigable rivers, and settlement locations underscores the importance of geographical and environmental knowledge for potential future operations. The initial expedition in 55 BCE involved a small contingent of Roman forces, approximately 2 legions supported by auxiliary troops. Caesar's account emphasizes logistical challenges, including adverse tides, unfamiliar landing sites, and resistance from local tribes. Archaeologists have debated the precise landing locations, with sites in Kent frequently proposed based on topographical correspondence and evidence of temporary Roman encampments. Coin hoards discovered in southeastern Britain suggest some level of pre-existing trade and contact with the continent, corroborating Caesar's observation that local elites were already familiar with Mediterranean goods and practices. Caesar's first landing was limited in scale, with reconnaissance and minor skirmishes serving as the primary objectives. Engagements with tribal groups, likely Trinovants or Cativolani factions, demonstrated both the defensive capability and the disunity of local societies. Caesar reports that his forces faced difficulty maneuvering through marshy terrain and encountering organized resistance. While modern scholarship questions the scale and nature of these encounters, archaeological surveys of the Kentish coastline provide evidence of temporary fortifications consistent with a short-term expeditionary presence. The following year, 54 BCE, saw a second and larger expedition, involving additional legions and a more substantial naval component. This campaign allowed Caesar to penetrate further inland, engaging with tribal leaders through a combination of negotiation and coercion. According to classical sources, some British tribes sought to avoid confrontation by offering hostages and tribute, highlighting the variable response of local societies. These interactions demonstrate that Britain was politically fragmented, with some elites willing to collaborate, while others resisted Roman encroachment. Caesar's diplomatic approach involved recognizing tribal hierarchies, imposing tribute obligations, and demonstrating military superiority without establishing lasting occupation. Classical texts indicate that he received hostages from prominent leaders, thereby creating temporary bonds of loyalty. Archaeological evidence of imported Roman goods, including Gallic amphorae and bronze items, supports the assertion that some coastal communities had already engaged in continental trade networks. Such economic integration may have influenced the willingness of certain tribes to negotiate rather than resist. The expeditions also provided valuable intelligence on the logistical requirements of a larger-scale invasion. Caesar's observations regarding tidal patterns, beach gradients, and river access informed later Roman campaigns. The reconnaissance revealed both opportunities and limitations, including regions suitable for troop landings and areas where tribal fortifications or difficult terrain could impede military operations. Roman records suggest that the limited scope of the expeditions was deliberate, reflecting strategic caution and the prioritization of reconnaissance over conquest. Despite the absence of occupation, the expeditions had lasting political implications. Caesar established Britain as a site of Roman interest, situating it within the broader framework of imperial expansion. His campaigns reinforced Rome's awareness of the island's economic potential, including access to tin, lead, and other resources. Although Caesar ultimately withdrew to Gaul, the expeditions demonstrated that Britain was within Rome's operational reach and merited future attention. Evidence for Caesar's activities in Britain must be interpreted cautiously. While literary sources provide detailed narratives, archaeological confirmation remains limited. Coin hoards, temporary encampment traces, and imported artifacts lend support to the accounts, but the scale and impact of the expeditions were far smaller than later Roman occupation. Scholars emphasize that these campaigns were reconnaissance missions, designed to gather information, demonstrate power, and establish initial diplomatic relations rather than to enforce direct control. The political outcomes of Caesar's expeditions were complex. Some tribes temporarily aligned with Rome through tribute arrangements or hostage exchanges, while others maintained independence. This uneven response illustrates the fragmented nature of Iron Age Britain, where no single authority could negotiate or resist on behalf of the entire island. The campaigns highlight the importance of local agency in shaping interactions with external powers, a dynamic that would continue during the Claudian invasion nearly a century later. Caesar's expeditions also shaped the Roman conceptual geography of the island. By mapping river systems, assessing settlements, and recording tribal affiliations, the Romans created a mental and administrative framework for future operations. Coastal regions were identified as landing points, inland routes were noted, and areas of strategic importance were classified. This systematic assessment of terrain, resources, and social organization established the foundation for later military planning and provincial administration. The 55 and 54 BCE campaigns illustrate the dual nature of early Roman engagement with Britain, simultaneously military and diplomatic, exploratory and coercive. The expeditions revealed the logistical and political realities of crossing the Channel and interacting with fragmented tribal societies. While Caesar did not establish enduring Roman authority, his records highlight the potential benefits of engagement and the challenges posed by the island's geography, social structure, and regional diversity. By the conclusion of these expeditions, Britain had entered the Roman sphere of influence without becoming a province. Caesar's reconnaissance established precedents in military planning, intelligence gathering, and diplomatic interaction that would inform future incursions. Although Rome did not maintain a permanent presence, the island's strategic value, economic potential, and political complexity had been recognized and documented, ensuring that Britain would remain a target of imperial consideration in the decades leading up to formal conquest. Although Caesar withdrew, Britain remained within Rome's strategic awareness. Knowledge gained from the expeditions informed later imperial policy, facilitated communication with British elites, and provided insight into local power dynamics. These early encounters established a pattern of engagement based on reconnaissance, negotiation, and selective intervention, setting the stage for the more sustained Roman campaigns of the 1st century CE. Long before legions landed, Roman goods and influence were already present across Britain. During the late Republic and early Principate, the island participated in sustained economic exchange with the continent, establishing networks that would later facilitate conquest and administration. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that imported products, including wine amphorae, fine pottery, and bronze vessels, were circulated in southern and eastern Britain. These materials are found at coastal settlements and Opata, indicating that trade networks linked Britain with Gaul and the wider Mediterranean world. Coinage, particularly silver staters and gold issues influenced by continental designs, further illustrates the penetration of Roman economic models prior to formal occupation. Client kings played a pivotal role in mediating Roman influence. Numismatic evidence identifies Cunobelinus, ruler of the Cativalani, as a central figure in southeastern Britain during the late 1st century BCE and early 1st century CE. His coins, often inscribed with his name and title, demonstrate an awareness of Roman monetary conventions and suggest active engagement with continental economies. By issuing coinage resembling Roman prototypes, Cunobelinus projected authority both internally and externally, reinforcing alliances and signaling participation in a broader network of political and economic exchange. Diplomatic relationships extended beyond numismatic representation. Archaeological evidence, including imported luxury goods and inscriptions, suggests that certain tribal elites maintained regular contact with Roman officials and merchants. These interactions were transactional and strategic. Local rulers received prestige, trade opportunities, and access to exotic materials, while Rome gained intelligence about the island's political landscape and economic potential. This indirect influence exemplifies Rome's preference for establishing client relationships rather than immediate territorial control. By fostering local allies, the empire minimized military expenditure while maintaining strategic leverage. Trade networks were geographically structured. Southern Britain, particularly along the Thames estuary, functioned as a conduit for imported commodities. Excavations at sites such as Verulamium and Colchester indicate storage facilities and workshop spaces capable of handling imported goods. Ceramic analysis identifies Gaulish Samian ware, amphora fragments for wine transport, and bronze vessels from continental workshops. Coin hoards found in these regions demonstrate not only circulation of wealth but also the presence of active market systems capable of sustaining elite consumption and redistribution. This evidence underscores the integration of southern Britain into a trans-channel economic system. The distribution of imported goods was uneven, reflecting both environmental and political factors. Fertile lowlands supported denser populations, creating hubs of economic activity. In contrast, upland regions and western territories experienced less direct interaction with continental trade, preserving localized economic practices. Archaeological surveys of hill forts in Wales and northern England reveal limited evidence of imported goods, suggesting that Roman influence reached these regions primarily through elite intermediaries or occasional diplomatic contact. The disparity in material culture highlights the differentiated nature of Roman engagement across Britain. Numismatic and archaeological evidence indicates that Roman cultural influence extended beyond material goods. Coins bearing Roman-style imagery and inscriptions served as instruments of political messaging, communicating allegiance, legitimacy, and participation in broader economic networks. Elite elites in Britain, particularly those aligned with Cunobelinus, appear to have selectively adopted Roman symbols and practices to reinforce their authority internally, while negotiating the terms of external relations with Rome. These adaptations suggest that imperial influence was enacted through subtle integration rather than coercive imposition. Military considerations also shaped diplomatic arrangements. Coastal tribes had to balance relations with Rome to protect their territories from punitive expeditions, as Caesar's reconnaissance campaigns had demonstrated. By offering hostages, tribute, or access to trade, some British rulers maintained relative autonomy while avoiding direct confrontation. Evidence of fortified Opata along the Thames and other riverine routes indicates that strategic settlement continued even under diplomatic accommodation, reinforcing the role of geography and infrastructure in mediating Roman influence. Political fragmentation allowed for differentiated responses to Roman engagement. While southeastern elites integrated closely with trade networks and diplomatic channels, northern and western tribes maintained autonomy and limited contact. This uneven integration demonstrates that Roman expansion into Britain was phased and adaptive, relying on both negotiation and intelligence gathering to identify opportunities for influence. Rather than a sudden or uniform imposition of authority, Rome's presence was layered and variable, contingent on local conditions and elite cooperation. By the end of the early 1st century CE, Britain had entered a quasi-Roman economic and political sphere. Trade networks were well established, client kings exercised influence over both internal and external affairs, and material culture reflected selective Romanization. These developments facilitated future conquest, providing Rome with economic targets, allied intermediaries, and intelligence on local power structures. Importantly, the island's integration was largely voluntary, mediated through elite choice rather than coercion, illustrating the empire's capacity for indirect governance. This period demonstrates that Roman expansion proceeded incrementally. Knowledge, material exchange, and diplomatic ties created conditions conducive to later military intervention. Britain's elite networks, trade hubs, and proto-urban centers provided the logistical and political infrastructure necessary for a more permanent Roman presence. Although formal annexation would not occur until the Claudian invasion of 43 CE, the foundations of imperial control were already being laid through economic integration and strategic diplomacy. This indirect influence ultimately gave way to direct military intervention. The legions that would arrive under Aulus Plautius encountered a landscape shaped not only by tribal authority and regional variation, but also by prior exposure to Roman goods, currency, and administrative concepts. Understanding this pre-existing framework is essential for interpreting the initial stages of conquest, as the empire built upon relationships and infrastructure already in place. Britain had already begun its transformation from a network of independent tribes into a province poised for incorporation into Rome's territorial system. In 43 CE, Rome committed fully to Britain for the first time. Unlike previous reconnaissance missions or indirect influence through client kings, this campaign marked a sustained military and administrative effort aimed at territorial annexation. The Claudian invasion, led by Aulus Plautius, combined tactical planning, logistical coordination, and symbolic assertion of imperial authority. Literary sources, including Cassius Dio and Tacitus, describe a multi-pronged operation designed to secure the southeastern coast, neutralize key tribal resistance, and establish colonial control. Archaeological evidence, from temporary forts to military roads, corroborates the scale and organization of this endeavor. The initial landing likely occurred along the Kentish coast, chosen for its navigable beaches, access to rivers, and proximity to the Cativalani and Trinovans territories. Contemporary accounts indicate that 4 legions, accompanied by auxiliary units drawn from across the empire, crossed the channel with substantial naval support. The expedition was meticulously provisioned, with ships carrying not only troops but also siege equipment, supplies, and animals for logistics and foraging. Archaeological remains of temporary military encampments along the southeastern coast support textual descriptions of the organized staging of forces prior to inland advancement. Early engagements focused on the systematic defeat of tribal centers that had previously exercised regional authority. Tacitus reports that the Trinovans submitted quickly, partly due to internal divisions and pre-existing client ties to Rome. By contrast, the Cativalani under Caratacus and Tagadumnus resisted fiercely, engaging Roman legions in pitched battles. Archaeological surveys of fortifications and hill forts indicate that Roman forces frequently relied on combined arms tactics, including disciplined infantry formations and coordinated use of auxiliary cavalry. Strategic occupation of river valleys enabled the Romans to control movement, supply routes, and trade corridors, limiting the mobility of resisting tribes. The symbolic role of Emperor Claudius was central to the campaign. Tacitus emphasizes that Claudius personally traveled to the southern coast to preside over the surrender of key towns, including Camulogenum. This presence underscored the imperial authority behind the military operation and signaled to both Roman and local audiences the seriousness of the annexation. Archaeological evidence from Camulogenum, later Colchester, demonstrates rapid establishment of colonial infrastructure, including defensive earthworks, roads, and public buildings, consistent with Roman urban and military planning. The selection of Camulogenum as a colonial center illustrates the dual function of conquest and governance. The site, strategically located near the Thames estuary, provided access to maritime routes, fertile agricultural land, and a network of tributary tribes. Excavations reveal a planned grid layout, public buildings, and early civic structures, suggesting that the Romans intended the city to serve as both a military base and a center of administrative authority. This urban foundation allowed Rome to project power locally while integrating the surrounding region into the emerging provincial system. Roman military strategy in these campaigns reflected both logistical foresight and adaptive engagement. Roads constructed between forts and newly occupied towns facilitated troop movement and supply distribution. Archaeological evidence from the Stane Street and other early Roman roads demonstrates deliberate planning to connect strategic points, ensuring rapid reinforcement and economic integration. Forts along these routes functioned as staging posts, storage centers, and instruments of control over the conquered territory. This combination of mobility, infrastructure, and urban colonization exemplifies Rome's integrated approach to conquest. The early campaigns also exposed tensions between Roman authority and local societies. Resistance was uneven, with some tribes submitting quickly and others continuing guerrilla warfare or seeking refuge in less accessible uplands. Hill forts that had been centers of power in the Iron Age were frequently repurposed as points of resistance, requiring sustained Roman military attention. Tacitus notes that Caratacus retreated to western territories after initial defeats, signaling both the limits of early Roman control and the persistence of organized opposition. Archaeological surveys in the Thames Valley and surrounding regions support evidence of continued tribal presence and intermittent conflict during this period. Economic considerations influenced the trajectory of conquest. Roman authorities sought to secure access to fertile lands, control trade routes, and exploit mineral resources. By establishing Camulogenum and linking it to military roads, the empire integrated local production into provincial supply chains. Coinage from this period demonstrates both the introduction of Roman monetary systems and continued use of local silver issues, reflecting a transitional economy that blended Roman administrative control with existing regional practices. The combination of military force and political symbolism in 43 CE set a precedent for Roman operations throughout Britain. By coordinating large-scale troop movements, engaging in selective diplomacy, and establishing urban centers, the Claudian invasion exemplified the empire's capacity to combine coercion and integration. Archaeological evidence, including temporary camps, fortifications, and road networks, corroborates textual accounts, confirming that the initial campaigns were meticulously planned and executed with strategic purpose. In addition to immediate territorial gains, the early campaigns established frameworks for governance and administration. Roman authorities implemented systems of tribute, monitored elite interactions, and reinforced settlements along key waterways. The presence of military infrastructure provided both security and oversight, enabling the integration of newly conquered regions into the broader provincial structure. This approach laid the foundation for subsequent campaigns and the gradual expansion into central and northern Britain. By the conclusion of the first phase of the invasion, southeastern Britain had been largely pacified. The submission of key tribes, establishment of Camulogenum as a colonial center, and construction of roads and forts facilitated the consolidation of Roman authority. Nevertheless, resistance persisted in more distant and geographically challenging regions, requiring continued military presence and strategic planning. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that Rome's initial victories were significant, yet incomplete, revealing both the strengths and limitations of early conquest. Initial victories also highlighted the complexity of administering conquered territories. While some local elites were incorporated into the Roman system through collaboration and tribute, others remained outside direct control, necessitating ongoing surveillance and occasional punitive expeditions. This uneven integration underscores the adaptive nature of Roman governance, which relied on both coercion and negotiation to establish long-term authority. These early campaigns exposed the tensions between Roman authority and local societies, setting the stage for subsequent uprisings and military operations. Understanding the interplay of military logistics, urban colonization, and political negotiation during the 43 CE invasion provides essential context for interpreting the following 2 decades of conflict and consolidation. Roman strategies of combining force, infrastructure, and symbolic authority would define the province's development throughout the mid-1st century CE. Roman control nearly collapsed within 2 decades of conquest. By 60 CE, the province faced significant unrest rooted in administrative practices, economic pressures, and the treatment of local elites. Tacitus provides the primary literary account of the Boudiccan revolt, describing it as a response to accumulated grievances, including the confiscation of land from British aristocracy, the imposition of punitive fines, and the settlement of Roman veterans on former tribal estates. Archaeological evidence, including burn layers in Londinium, Verulamium, and Camulogenum, corroborates reports of widespread destruction, confirming that the revolt had both urban and regional impact. The immediate cause of the revolt lay in the policies of Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, the provincial governor, whose enforcement of Roman administrative measures often disregarded local customs. Confiscation of the estates of the Iceni following the death of King Persutigus generated resentment, particularly among his widow Boudica. Tacitus reports that she was publicly humiliated and her daughters assaulted, igniting a coalition of British tribes, including the Trinovants, Brigantes, and other neighboring groups. This sequence of events illustrates how Roman practices, while consistent with imperial policy elsewhere, could generate acute instability in newly conquered regions where local authority remained influential. The revolt demonstrated the continued capacity of tribal societies to organize militarily in response to perceived injustice. Boudica's coalition mobilized thousands of warriors, exploiting both geographical knowledge and local resources. Archaeological survey indicates that the rebel forces moved rapidly, attacking urban centers along Roman road networks. The destruction of Camulogenum, which had served as the initial colonial capital, is attested by extensive burn layers, pottery shards, and collapsed building remains. Similar evidence at Londinium and Verulamium indicates coordinated attacks that overwhelmed Roman garrisons and civilian populations, demonstrating both strategic planning and the intensity of the uprising. Tacitus emphasizes the symbolic and practical impact of the revolt. Cities that had recently been integrated into the Roman system were destroyed, and Roman settlers and administrators were killed or expelled. The rapid success of Boudica's forces highlighted the vulnerabilities of a province still consolidating under foreign rule. Archaeological analysis of these sites reveals both structural collapse and traces of hastily abandoned settlements, confirming the large-scale nature of the revolt and the material consequences of resistance. Roman military response combined rapid reinforcement, tactical maneuvering, and decisive engagement. Suetonius Paulinus, previously campaigning in Wales, redirected his forces to confront the uprising. The final engagement, likely near the Midlands, demonstrated the discipline and logistical advantage of Roman legions. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Roman forces utilized terrain, fortified positions, and coordinated infantry and cavalry tactics to achieve victory. Tacitus reports heavy casualties among the insurgents, while Roman losses were comparatively limited, illustrating the continued effectiveness of Roman military organization even under crisis conditions. The revolt had significant consequences for provincial governance. Rome recognized the need to adjust its approach to local administration, land settlement, and the treatment of elites. Following the suppression of the uprising, policies emphasized reconciliation with local aristocracy, integration of cooperative tribal leaders into administrative roles, and careful monitoring of urban and rural populations. Archaeological evidence of reconstructed towns, including the rebuilding of Londinium with fortified structures and urban planning, reflects this strategic shift. The emphasis on infrastructure, roads, and military oversight ensured both economic recovery and enhanced security. Economic factors played a central role in the revolt and its aftermath. Excessive taxation, tribute demands, and exploitation of resources had fueled resentment among both tribal elites and commoners. The destruction of urban centers disrupted trade and production, necessitating investment in reconstruction and realignment of fiscal policy. Coinage from the post-revolt period shows both continuity of Roman monetary systems and local adaptation, indicating a resumption of economic integration under revised governance. Markets, workshops, and imported goods returned to key settlements, restoring the province's commercial function while reinforcing Roman authority. The revolt also had a lasting social impact. Boudica emerged as a figurehead of resistance, demonstrating the capacity of tribal coalitions to challenge imperial power, even temporarily. Roman accounts emphasized the moral and political lessons of the uprising, interpreting it as a cautionary example of the consequences of mismanagement and cultural insensitivity. Archaeological interpretation of burn layers, abandonment patterns, and subsequent reconstruction provides tangible evidence of the upheaval experienced by civilian populations, while also illustrating the resilience of local communities under Roman restoration policies. Military infrastructure was adapted in response to the revolt. Fortifications around key urban centers were reinforced, garrisons were expanded, and roads were maintained to facilitate troop movement. Excavations of Londinium show the introduction of defensive earthworks and watchtowers, reflecting a shift in Roman strategy from rapid conquest to sustainable occupation. This enhanced military presence, combined with political accommodation of local elites, created a more stable environment for provincial administration, reducing the likelihood of large-scale uprisings in the immediate decades following the revolt. The Boudican Revolt demonstrates the interplay between governance, social structure, and military power. Roman control was contingent not only on military supremacy but also on the management of local relationships and economic obligations. The uprising illustrates how failure to account for these factors could rapidly destabilize imperial authority, even in a province equipped with well-trained legions and colonial infrastructure. The revolt's suppression provided a model for future provincial management, emphasizing the importance of balancing coercion with integration. By the end of 61 CE, Rome had restored control over southeastern Britain and reinforced its strategic presence. Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium were rebuilt under Roman guidance, while military and administrative reforms ensured both defense and economic continuity. Archaeological layers demonstrate not only reconstruction but also the institutionalization of Roman urban and provincial systems. These measures marked a turning point in Britain's incorporation, shifting from tentative conquest to structured governance with enduring imperial oversight. Rome responded by restructuring how Britain would be governed. Lessons from the Boudican Revolt informed the appointment of provincial governors, the allocation of legions, and the engagement with tribal elites. Military roads, fortified urban centers, and strategic garrisons facilitated both security and administrative efficiency. This period of consolidation set the stage for subsequent expansion into central and northern territories, ensuring that Roman authority could withstand both internal unrest and external threats. The revolt, therefore, served as a critical juncture in shaping the province's institutional and military landscape. Conquest was only the beginning of Roman rule. Once military victories secured southeastern Britain, the empire turned to the complex task of administration. Establishing provincial governance involved implementing bureaucratic structures, legal frameworks, taxation systems, and population monitoring, all designed to integrate Britain into the imperial system. The creation of these structures allowed Rome to project authority efficiently, maintain security, and extract resources while providing a basis for economic and social organization across newly conquered territories. The provincial bureaucracy was anchored by the governor, typically of senatorial rank, who combined military command with civil administration. Governors were responsible for overseeing troop deployments, adjudicating disputes, managing taxation, and implementing imperial decrees. Tacitus and Cassius Dio described the governor's role as both military commander and representative of the emperor, a dual function essential in a recently conquered and politically fragmented province. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and building remains, confirms the presence of administrative centers in key settlements such as Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium. Legal systems were formalized to replace tribal customary law and enforce imperial authority. Roman law applied to citizens, provincial elites, and municipal institutions, while local customs persisted in rural areas under supervision. Courts were established in urban centers, presided over by officials acting under the governor's authority. Inscriptions and legal tablets demonstrate the codification of contracts, property rights, and dispute resolution procedures. These mechanisms provided predictability in civil affairs, reinforced elite loyalty, and facilitated trade and taxation, forming the backbone of provincial stability. Taxation was a critical instrument of control and resource extraction. The province was assessed for tribute, agricultural levies, and tolls, often collected through local intermediaries. Archaeological evidence, including tally sticks, coin hoards, and storage facilities, supports the existence of organized collection systems. Tax revenues funded military garrisons, urban construction, and administrative operations, ensuring that imperial infrastructure could function while integrating local economies into broader provincial networks. Census practices, conducted periodically, allowed Roman authorities to enumerate populations, assess wealth, and allocate obligations, creating detailed knowledge of demographic and economic conditions. Urban centers functioned as both administrative and symbolic anchors of authority. Camulogenum, reconstructed following the Boudiccan Revolt, served as a colonia for veteran soldiers, a hub of governance, and a model of Roman urban planning. Grid layouts, forums, basilicas, and temples reflected both functional requirements and the projection of imperial presence. Londinium emerged as a commercial and administrative nucleus, with public buildings and infrastructure supporting legal proceedings, markets, and civic oversight. Archaeological excavations reveal evidence of granaries, warehouses, and road networks designed to link urban authority to surrounding rural areas. Local elites were co-opted into the administrative framework to facilitate governance and reduce resistance. Tribal leaders who had previously exercised regional authority were granted positions within municipal councils, allowed to maintain ceremonial prerogatives, and incorporated into the imperial patronage system. Inscriptions document the service of local magnates in civic roles, demonstrating continuity of influence while aligning their interests with Roman objectives. This strategy of selective integration strengthened the legitimacy of provincial rule and provided intermediaries for taxation, law enforcement, and military recruitment. Infrastructure underpinned administrative control. Roads, bridges, and river crossings enabled rapid communication, troop movements, and the transport of goods and tribute. Military forts, strategically positioned along key routes, served both defensive and administrative functions, while facilitating surveillance of local populations. Archaeological evidence from roads such as Stain Street and Wattling Street demonstrates deliberate engineering to connect military, economic, and administrative centers. These networks allowed governors and legions to respond efficiently to disturbances while consolidating imperial oversight. Civic institutions provided mechanisms for local governance, urban management, and legal authority. Forums served as venues for public business and adjudication, while temples and civic buildings reinforced the ideological presence of Rome. The standardization of municipal structures across the province facilitated consistent administration, enabling Rome to maintain authority in areas geographically distant from the imperial core. Archaeological remnants of basilicas, granaries, and public baths reflect the practical and symbolic roles these institutions played in embedding Roman rule. Communication systems reinforced control across the province. Road networks, courier services, and signaling stations allowed governors to relay orders, monitor military activity, and oversee fiscal operations. Roman inscriptions and milestones indicate official oversight of transport routes, providing tangible evidence of the administrative infrastructure supporting provincial governance. The integration of rural and urban areas through these channels enhanced Rome's ability to coordinate policy, enforce law, and maintain security. The establishment of provincial administration also addressed potential sources of unrest. Following the Boudiccan Revolt, strategic distribution of legions and fortifications ensured rapid military response to localized disturbances. Urban centers served as surveillance nodes, while co-opted elites provided intelligence on regional developments. These measures allowed Roman authority to stabilize the province, facilitating economic recovery, urban development, and gradual cultural integration. By the late 1st century CE, the combination of military oversight, legal codification, taxation, and civic infrastructure had transformed Britain from a network of independent tribes into a functioning Roman province. Administrative frameworks enabled the collection of revenue, the enforcement of law, and the integration of local elites, creating a foundation for both security and economic growth. Urban centers anchored governance, while roads and fortifications extended imperial presence into rural territories. This systemic approach ensured that Roman authority could endure beyond the immediate capacity of military conquest alone. The implementation of provincial bureaucracy highlights the sophisticated coordination required to sustain empire. Success depended not only on martial supremacy but also on consistent legal frameworks, structured taxation, and the integration of local actors. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates that these systems were operational within decades of conquest, illustrating the efficiency and adaptability of Roman administration in newly annexed regions. Administrative control required urban centers to anchor authority. The subsequent expansion of cities, enhancement of civic infrastructure, and integration of regional elites provided both practical mechanisms and symbolic affirmation of Rome's presence. Understanding the establishment of provincial governance is essential to interpreting subsequent developments in Roman Britain, including economic integration, cultural transformation, and military consolidation. The province's durability depended on the careful orchestration of administration, infrastructure, and local cooperation, setting the stage for the century-long evolution of Roman rule. Cities became the visible framework of Roman Britain. Following the consolidation of military and administrative control, the empire established a network of urban centers designed to anchor governance, commerce, and social organization. Archaeological evidence from coloniae, municipia, and civitates demonstrates that Roman urbanization was both functional and symbolic, serving as a mechanism to project imperial authority while integrating local populations into standardized civic systems. The expansion of towns facilitated the management of taxation, law, and trade, embedding Roman structures across the province. The coloniae were settlements founded primarily for retired legionaries, combining military security with urban infrastructure. Camulogenum, the earliest colonia in Britain, illustrates this dual function. Excavations reveal a planned street grid, fortified boundaries, public buildings such as basilicas and forums, and temples dedicated to imperial cults. These centers operated as administrative hubs, providing space for civic gatherings, legal proceedings, and religious observance. The presence of veteran settlers ensured loyalty to Rome and supplied a ready pool of experienced personnel to maintain local security. Municipia represented communities with a degree of self-governance, often populated by indigenous elites who had been incorporated into the Roman administrative framework. Verulamium and glevum, for example, demonstrate urban layouts featuring central forums, public baths, granaries, and marketplaces, all structured according to Roman architectural principles. Archaeological evidence indicates these towns balanced Roman standards with local continuity, as indicated by the persistence of native building materials and adaptation to pre-existing topography. Municipal institutions allowed local populations to participate in governance while operating under overarching imperial authority. Civitates functioned as administrative centers for tribal territories, serving as intermediaries between rural populations and Roman officials. These towns often housed magistrates, tax collectors, and courts responsible for legal enforcement across surrounding districts. Excavations at civitates show evidence of roads linking them to outlying settlements, public buildings for civic administration, and spaces for both legal and commercial activity. By structuring provincial governance around these centers, Rome ensured the systematic collection of tribute, supervision of population movements, and monitoring of potential unrest. The urban network was deliberately connected through transportation and communication infrastructure. Roads, bridges, and river crossings linked coloniae, municipia, and civitates, facilitating the movement of troops, officials, and goods. Milestones and inscriptions provide evidence of standardized measurements, maintenance responsibilities, and oversight by provincial authorities. The integration of urban centers into a cohesive network allowed Rome to project power effectively, enabling rapid administrative action across geographically dispersed regions. Public buildings reflected both practical and ideological functions. Forums served as centers for markets, judicial proceedings, and municipal gatherings, while temples reinforced the ideological presence of Rome through religious practice and imperial cult observance. Granaries and warehouses supported economic stability, storing surplus agricultural products to ensure provisioning of urban populations and military units. Bath complexes and amphitheaters provided venues for hygiene, leisure, and civic engagement, promoting Roman social norms while fostering local participation in imperial institutions. Urban planning emphasized standardization, yet adapted to local conditions. Archaeological surveys demonstrate that street grids, building dimensions, and public spaces conformed to Roman models, but the placement of structures often accommodated pre-existing topography and settlement patterns. This balance between imperial standards and local adaptation facilitated efficient administration while maintaining continuity for indigenous populations. Evidence of local materials, construction techniques, and decorative motifs highlight selective integration rather than complete cultural replacement. The expansion of civic institutions also facilitated legal and administrative governance. Courts and municipal offices enabled the enforcement of Roman law, management of property rights, and regulation of commercial activity. Inscriptions document appointments of local magistrates and civic officials, indicating participation of indigenous elites in urban administration. By incorporating local authority within Roman structures, the empire reduced potential resistance while ensuring compliance with imperial regulations. Economic functions underpinned urban life. Towns served as marketplaces for both imported and locally produced goods, including pottery, metalwork, and agricultural products. Coinage circulated widely, demonstrating integration into imperial fiscal systems. The location of urban centers along roads, rivers, and coastal routes optimized access to trade networks, linking rural production zones to administrative hubs. Archaeological finds of amphorae, imported ceramics, and workshop debris indicate sustained engagement in long-distance commerce, reflecting the economic integration essential to provincial stability. Religious institutions were integral to civic identity and political cohesion. Temples and shrines dedicated to Roman deities, alongside spaces for local cults, anchored towns ideologically within the imperial framework. Inscriptions and architectural remains suggest that the adoption of Roman religious practices reinforced municipal authority and provided a platform for elite participation in public life. Civic ceremonies, festivals, and cult observances strengthened the symbolic presence of Rome while promoting social cohesion among diverse populations. The distribution of urban centers reflected both strategic and administrative priorities. Southeastern and central Britain, with fertile land and established trade routes, hosted the densest concentration of towns. Northern and western regions saw fewer, more strategically positioned centers, often aligned with military garrisons and fortified settlements. Archaeological surveys indicate that urban development corresponded with both resource availability and military oversight, demonstrating the intertwined nature of governance, infrastructure, and regional control. The creation of urban networks also enhanced provincial security. Roads facilitated rapid troop deployment, while fortified structures within towns provided defensive capabilities. Civic institutions served as observation points for administrative officials and local magistrates, enabling early detection of unrest or external threats. The integration of military and civic planning underscores the Roman strategy of combining administrative, economic, and defensive functions within urban frameworks. By the early 2nd century CE, the pattern of Roman urbanization had become firmly established. Cities functioned as nodes of administration, commerce, justice, and cultural integration. Archaeological evidence confirms widespread adoption of Roman architectural standards, infrastructure, and civic institutions, while local materials and practices remained visible, demonstrating selective adaptation. The urban network provided the structural backbone for provincial governance, economic integration, and long-term stability, illustrating how Romanization operated through institutional mechanisms rather than cultural erasure. Urban life depended on economic integration. Towns connected rural production zones, trade networks, and administrative oversight, enabling the efficient extraction of resources, regulation of populations, and reinforcement of social hierarchies. Civic institutions, public infrastructure, and urban planning facilitated sustained Roman control. ensuring that authority extended beyond military occupation into the daily functioning of society. Understanding the development of urban centers and civic institutions is essential to interpreting the broader processes of Romanization in Britain, encompassing governance, economy, and social organization. Roman Britain's economy rested first on its capacity to feed itself. Agriculture formed the structural foundation of provincial stability, supplying both urban populations and military garrisons, while generating surplus for trade and taxation. From the mid-1st century CE onward, villa estates emerged as the primary nodes of agricultural production, integrating local labor, advanced cultivation techniques, and regional distribution networks. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Chedworth, Fishbourne, and Lullingstone provides insight into the organization, scale, and economic function of these estates, illustrating a transition from subsistence farming to market-oriented production. Villa layouts reveal carefully planned estates, combining residential structures with functional agricultural facilities. Central courtyards, granaries, barns, and workshops indicate that villas were not merely elite residences but operational centers for managing labor, storing produce, and processing raw materials. Excavations at Fishbourne, for example, demonstrate storage facilities capable of sustaining both estate personnel and surplus allocation to local markets or imperial supply chains. This evidence indicates systematic integration of agricultural production into broader economic and administrative structures, reflecting both local management and provincial oversight. Land tenure systems facilitated the consolidation of estates and the efficient use of resources. Evidence from field boundaries, enclosures, and boundary markers shows that land was divided into systematic plots, often optimized for crop rotation and animal husbandry. Roman practices such as centuriation and the application of standardized measurements enhanced productivity and ensured accurate assessment for taxation purposes. Villa owners, whether Roman settlers, local elites, or cooperators within the imperial system, acted as intermediaries between provincial authorities and rural populations, coordinating labor, production schedules, and delivery of surplus. Technological innovations increased agricultural output. Improved iron plows, advanced harnessing systems, and water management techniques enhanced soil productivity, particularly in the fertile lowlands of southeastern Britain. Archaeobotanical evidence indicates the introduction and wider cultivation of Mediterranean crops, including wheat, barley, and grapes, alongside traditional British cereals. These changes allowed for diversification of production and increased yields, ensuring both local subsistence and the accumulation of surplus for trade or imperial requisition. Animal husbandry formed a complementary component of the villa economy. Remains from cattle, sheep, and pigs indicate integration of livestock management with arable farming. Estates maintained pastures, pens, and processing facilities, including barns and workshops for wool and leather production. The combination of crop cultivation and livestock rearing enhanced economic resilience, allowing estates to provide stable resources for local populations, urban centers, and military units while generating commodities for market exchange. The villa economy also supported social hierarchies and administrative coordination. Villas were typically controlled by elite landowners, often aligned with Roman governance structures. These owners managed labor, collected rents, and maintained estate accounts, acting as local intermediaries for taxation and resource distribution. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and domestic architecture, indicates the presence of administrative rooms, tallying devices, and storage management, reflecting the organizational sophistication of villa operations. Integration into provincial supply networks reinforced the economic importance of agricultural surplus. Granaries within villas facilitated accumulation and storage, while roads connected estates to urban markets, military bases, and ports. The movement of goods along these networks allowed urban populations to access essential foodstuffs, provided logistical support for legions, and enabled trade both within Britain and across the Channel. Coin finds associated with estate sites suggest the monetization of agricultural output and participation in local and regional economic exchanges. Regional specialization emerged within Britain's agricultural system. Southeastern estates focused on grain, horticulture, and animal husbandry for urban consumption and imperial provisioning. Western and northern regions, less densely populated and with more challenging terrain, maintained mixed subsistence agriculture alongside smaller market-oriented estates. Archaeological surveys of field systems, storage structures, and villa complexes demonstrate the adaptability of production strategies to local geography, climate, and market demands. The villa economy supported not only material production but also social and administrative cohesion. Estate households employed local labor, including free tenants, slaves, and seasonal workers, to manage cultivation, harvesting, and storage. These labor arrangements reflected both continuity with pre-Roman practices and integration into Roman economic models. Inscriptions and household artifacts indicate management of labor contracts, resource allocation, and estate accounts, illustrating the systemic nature of production. Taxation and surplus extraction were closely tied to agricultural production. Provincial authorities relied on villa outputs to supply urban populations and military garrisons. The standardization of weights, measures, and accounting practices ensured that production could be monitored, quantified, and redistributed efficiently. Evidence of storage facilities and delivery records demonstrates the systematic collection of grain, livestock, and other commodities for taxation purposes, highlighting the interdependence between economic productivity and imperial administration. The villa system also enabled participation in interregional trade. Surplus production facilitated exchange with urban centers, other provinces, and the Mediterranean economy. Archaeological finds, including amphorae, imported pottery, and metal artifacts at villa sites, confirm that estates were not isolated but embedded within broader commercial networks. This integration strengthened economic stability, reinforced social hierarchies, and provided material incentives for cooperation with Roman authorities. By the late 1st and early 2nd centuries CE, the villa economy had become the backbone of Roman Britain. It provided the agricultural foundation for urban expansion, fiscal stability, and military provisioning. Estate management, technological innovation, and integration into provincial infrastructure allowed Britain to sustain urban populations, support garrisons, and generate surplus for trade. This economic base illustrates the essential connection between productive capacity and the long-term consolidation of Roman control. Agriculture in Roman Britain demonstrates the interplay of geography, technology, and administration. Fertile lands, improved cultivation methods, and systematic estate organization underpinned surplus production, which in turn enabled urban growth, trade networks, and administrative efficiency. Villa estates functioned as nodes linking rural production, local elites, and provincial authorities, illustrating how economic capacity directly reinforced political and military authority. Agricultural surplus enabled participation in regional and imperial trade networks. Estates supplied urban centers, military installations, and ports, creating a flow of goods and resources that anchored Roman authority and facilitated integration into broader economic systems. Understanding the villa economy is essential for interpreting Roman Britain's provincial development, demonstrating that effective governance relied as much on productive land management as on military or administrative structures. Movement of goods depended on movement of people, armies, and authority. In Roman Britain, the expansion of trade networks and the construction of roads transformed the province from a collection of rural settlements into an integrated economic system. Roads, ports, and standardized coinage facilitated not only the circulation of commodities but also the projection of administrative control. The strategic organization of infrastructure allowed Rome to coordinate taxation, supply military garrisons, and maintain communication across both urban and rural territories. Road construction served multiple purposes, linking military, administrative, and commercial nodes. Principal routes such as Watling Street, Ermine Street, and Fosse Way connected coloniae, municipia, and civitates to one another and to coastal ports. Archaeological surveys reveal that these roads were engineered with layers of compacted gravel, drainage systems, and measurable width to accommodate wheeled transport and legions. Milestones, many of which survive today, document distances and imperial oversight, confirming the official management of these arteries. Roads enabled rapid deployment of troops, efficient transport of tax goods, and consistent administrative connectivity, ensuring that provincial governance could operate across dispersed territories. Port infrastructure complemented road networks, enabling the import and export of goods across the English Channel and the North Sea. Excavations at Richborough, Dover, and Portus Lemanis reveal quays, warehouses, and docking facilities capable of handling amphorae, timber, metals, and other commodities. Maritime connections linked Britain to Gaul, the Rhineland, and the broader Mediterranean economy. Archaeological finds include imported Samian ware, wine amphorae, and glassware, demonstrating sustained demand for luxury and essential commodities and highlighting Britain's active participation in regional trade systems. Coin circulation underpinned the monetization of the provincial economy. Coin hoards, found across urban centers and villa estates, provide chronological markers for economic activity and illustrate the adoption of Roman currency. Coins facilitated taxation, market exchange, and payment to soldiers, embedding monetary systems in everyday life. Numismatic evidence indicates the presence of both imperial issues and localized mints, reflecting the integration of Britain into the broader imperial monetary framework. Coinage also reinforced political authority, as emperors' images and inscriptions symbolized Rome's governance throughout the province. Trade networks connected agricultural production with urban demand and military provisioning. Surplus from villa estates, including grain, livestock, and processed goods, moved along roads to towns and ports, sustaining both civilian and military populations. Conversely, imported products such as wine, olive oil, ceramics, and luxury textiles arrived in Britain via maritime and riverine routes, facilitating cultural and economic exchange. Archaeological evidence from warehouses, transport amphorae, and roadside settlements demonstrates a dynamic and organized flow of goods that underpinned provincial stability. The integration of infrastructure and trade had administrative consequences. Roads, ports, and coinage allowed provincial authorities to monitor the movement of commodities and people, ensuring effective taxation and legal compliance. Checkpoints, customs stations, and fortified urban centers regulated trade and reduced opportunities for smuggling or rebellion. Inscriptions documenting transport responsibilities, tolls, and magistrate oversight indicate the systematic incorporation of infrastructure into the broader apparatus of provincial governance. Urban centers acted as hubs of economic exchange, coordinating trade between rural production zones and maritime import channels. Markets, forums, and warehouses facilitated the redistribution of goods and served as focal points for commercial activity. Excavations at Londinium reveal marketplaces with organized stalls, granaries, and storage pits designed to manage the flow of imported and locally produced commodities. Civic institutions provided oversight, ensuring that markets operated under imperial regulations and that revenues were accurately accounted for in provincial records. Infrastructure also shaped regional specialization. Southeastern towns, with proximity to ports and fertile lands, became centers for grain export, horticulture, and artisanal production. Western and northern regions, more geographically isolated, maintained mixed economies with emphasis on pastoralism and local trade. Roads and rivers bridged these differences, allowing integration of local production into provincial and imperial networks. Archaeological surveys of route systems, river crossings, and trackways confirm the deliberate linking of these diverse economic zones. Maritime trade relied on both standardized containers and logistical management. Amphorae, often stamped with origins or contents, allowed easy identification and tracking of imported goods. Warehouses at port settlements were organized for efficient loading, storage, and distribution inland. Shipwrecks and harbor remains provide evidence for the scale and sophistication of maritime commerce, indicating that Britain was an active participant in Mediterranean economic circuits by the early 2nd century CE. Monetary and infrastructural integration also facilitated economic resilience. Coinage enabled flexible pricing, standardized exchange, and taxation in kind or in cash. Roads allowed redistribution of surplus during shortages, supported military logistics, and reinforced the authority of provincial governors. Together, these systems provided stability, ensuring that urban populations, military units, and elite estates could operate efficiently within the imperial economy. Evidence of economic confidence is visible in urban investment and market activity. The proliferation of imported luxury items, construction of commercial buildings, and maintenance of roads reflect active demand and sustained wealth circulation. Archaeological studies indicate that towns were capable of absorbing imported commodities, redistributing local produce, and supporting specialized crafts. Coin hoards demonstrate circulation, saving, and financial accumulation, reflecting both individual wealth and provincial economic robustness. Infrastructure also had symbolic significance. Roads, milestones, and port facilities conveyed Roman presence, efficiency, and authority. The visibility of organized networks reinforced political legitimacy and underscored the empire's capacity to govern distant territories. Urban centers, connected by these arteries, demonstrated the functionality of Roman administration, combining economic, military, and civic systems into an integrated provincial framework. By the early 2nd century CE, Britain's trade networks, roads, and monetization had transformed the province into a functioning component of the Roman Empire. Agricultural surplus, coin circulation, and transport infrastructure enabled economic integration, military provisioning, and administrative oversight. Archaeological and numismatic evidence confirms that Britain was fully embedded in interregional trade systems, contributing resources while absorbing imported goods and sustaining urban growth. Economic integration also reshaped religious, cultural, and social life. Market towns and port settlements became venues for exchange not only of goods but also ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. The circulation of coinage, imported wares, and standardized measurement systems reinforced Roman norms, encouraging participation in civic institutions and urban life. Infrastructure thus served as both practical and symbolic mechanisms for provincial cohesion, linking economy, governance, and social organization in ways that would endure for centuries. Roman rule did not erase religious traditions already embedded in British society. Before the arrival of legions and administrators, the peoples of Britain practiced localized, community-based religions rooted in natural landscapes, ancestral veneration, and tribal deities. Archaeological evidence from shrines, ritual deposits, and iconographic motifs indicates that these practices persisted throughout the Roman occupation, often adapting to coexist with imperial institutions rather than being suppressed. The continuity of indigenous religion provides insight into the resilience of cultural identity and the mechanisms of religious negotiation under Roman provincial structures. Sacred natural features, including springs, rivers, groves, and hilltops, served as focal points for ritual activity. Sites such as Bath Aquae Sulis illustrate this continuity, where the Celto-British deity Sulis was worshipped long before Roman integration. Excavations reveal votive deposits, inscriptions, and ritual artifacts demonstrating that indigenous beliefs persisted while Roman architectural forms and ceremonial practices were introduced. The monumental Bath complex, while Roman in design, accommodated pre-existing religious observances, highlighting the syncretic adaptation of local and imperial traditions. Votive deposits offer additional evidence of religious continuity. Hoards of coins, miniature tools, and animal remains found at sacred springs and groves indicate ritual offerings tied to both personal and communal needs. These deposits were geographically distributed, reflecting the regional diversity of belief systems. Archaeologists note that some offerings correspond with Roman coinage and imported objects, demonstrating selective incorporation of imperial elements into pre-existing cult practices without eroding the fundamental character of indigenous worship. Tribal deities remained central to community identity. The Brigantes, Trinovants, and Iceni, among other groups, maintained localized pantheons that governed social and political life. Ritual sites often functioned as loci for tribal gatherings, dispute resolution, and seasonal ceremonies. Iconographic analysis of altars and carvings demonstrates consistent motifs of fertility, protection, and martial favor, suggesting continuity of spiritual priorities across the Roman occupation. This persistence indicates that religion was not solely a matter of personal belief, but an institutional framework linking communities and reinforcing social cohesion. Integration with Roman structures occurred through selective syncretism. Indigenous deities were often identified with Roman gods of similar function, allowing local worship to continue under imperial recognition. At Aquae Sulis, for example, Sulis was equated with Minerva, permitting continuity of veneration while embedding the cult within a Roman religious framework. Inscriptions on altars reflect this dual identity, naming both the local deity and the Roman counterpart, highlighting the administrative accommodation of religious practices. This syncretism enabled Rome to recognize local traditions while reinforcing political and cultural authority. Regional variation characterized religious continuity. Northern and Western Britain, with less intensive Roman settlement, retained more autonomous worship structures, while southeastern towns integrated more fully into Roman architectural and ritual norms. Archaeological surveys indicate that even in urban centers, indigenous shrines persisted alongside temples to Roman deities. This distribution demonstrates the adaptability of local belief systems and the nuanced negotiation between imperial oversight and community practice. Religious continuity extended into funerary practices. Burial rites, grave goods, and cemetery organization reflect both long-standing tribal customs and selective adoption of Roman forms. Cremation and inhumation coexisted, with the choice of ritual and placement reflecting familial, tribal, and social identity. Funerary inscriptions occasionally incorporate Roman nomenclature and religious terminology, illustrating adaptation without displacement. These practices maintained community cohesion while accommodating the administrative and ideological framework of the empire. Ritual landscapes also facilitated the maintenance of oral traditions, seasonal observances, and communal festivals. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that Celtic and Romano-British communities celebrated agricultural cycles, solar events, and tribal commemorations. The continuity of ritual calendars and ceremonies reinforced regional identities while providing mechanisms for the negotiation of social hierarchy. Religious practice remained a communal institution, reflecting the persistence of governance, identity, and moral frameworks within local societies. The endurance of indigenous belief systems challenges assumptions that Romanization equated to cultural erasure. Instead, evidence demonstrates that religious frameworks were adapted, codified, and selectively integrated into provincial administration. Local elites often played a mediating role, facilitating ceremonies, funding constructions, and coordinating worship with imperial expectations. Inscriptions and dedications attest to the involvement of community leaders in preserving and transforming spiritual practices, highlighting the political dimension of religious continuity. Archaeological evidence also suggests that religious continuity influenced urban development. Temples and shrines were incorporated into town planning, positioned alongside forums, marketplaces, and public buildings. Sacred sites often determined the layout of streets, plazas, and civic structures, reinforcing the interconnection between spiritual practice and administrative control. This integration allowed local populations to maintain religious traditions while participating in Roman civic life, demonstrating that urbanization and religious continuity were mutually reinforcing processes. The persistence of indigenous cults had broader social implications. Religious observances provided a platform for community cohesion, reinforced local hierarchies, and mediated interactions with Roman authorities. Participation in rituals signaled allegiance to both tribal and imperial frameworks, enabling communities to navigate the demands of provincial governance. In this sense, religion functioned as a stabilizing force, facilitating cultural negotiation and social continuity under imperial rule. By the mid-2nd century CE, indigenous belief systems had become a component of a syncretic religious landscape. Local deities persisted, ritual practices continued, and communities maintained spiritual autonomy within the structural framework of Roman administration. Sites such as Aquae Sulis, along with rural shrines and votive deposits, illustrate how continuity, adaptation, and integration coexisted. Religious life in Britain was neither uniform nor entirely subordinate to Rome. It reflected a negotiated coexistence that reinforced both local identity and provincial stability. These traditions increasingly intersected with Roman religious institutions. Syncretism, architectural integration, and administrative recognition ensured that indigenous beliefs were preserved, adapted, and operational within the broader provincial context. The survival of local cults, combined with the presence of imperial temples, illustrates that religious practice in Roman Britain was complex, regionally varied, and resilient. Understanding this continuity provides insight into the broader processes of cultural integration, identity formation, and imperial governance in Roman provinces. Religious integration followed administrative and military consolidation. As Roman Britain became increasingly organized under provincial governance, formal religious institutions accompanied the spread of imperial authority. Temples, cults, and ritual practices were introduced not merely as spiritual activities, but as instruments of social cohesion and political legitimacy. Inscriptions from these sites record dedications by local magistrates, civic councils, and military personnel, signaling allegiance to imperial leadership. The cult encouraged uniformity of ritual across the province, creating a symbolic link between Rome and distant settlements, while offering indigenous elites a platform for demonstrating loyalty and integrating into the administrative hierarchy. Classical deities were introduced into Britain alongside the imperial cult. Temples and shrines to Jupiter, Mars, Minerva, and Venus appeared in towns, military forts, and port settlements. Evidence from altars, votive inscriptions, and iconography confirms that these gods were venerated not only by Roman citizens, but also by local elites and recruits from provincial backgrounds. The distribution of temples and dedications reflects the dual role of religious practice as both a personal devotion and a public instrument of social cohesion, anchoring Roman cultural norms across urban and rural landscapes. Syncretism characterized the adaptation of Roman and indigenous religious traditions. Local deities were often merged with classical gods, producing blended forms such as Sulis Minerva at Bath, Aquae Sulis. This integration allowed pre-existing cults to continue while embedding them within Roman religious frameworks, facilitating both continuity and imperial oversight. Archaeological evidence, including altars, votive deposits, and inscriptions, indicates that worshippers recognized the dual identity of such deities, combining traditional offerings with Roman ceremonial forms. This selective fusion reinforced the authority of provincial elites while ensuring cultural stability under imperial governance. Mystery religions and imported cults also reached Britain during this period. Practices associated with Mithras, Isis, and the cult of Cybele are documented at urban and military sites, suggesting diverse religious participation among soldiers and civilians. Mithraic temples, or Mithraea, were often constructed underground and positioned within forts or urban precincts. Inscriptions, iconography, and ritual artifacts indicate that these cults provided structured social networks, initiated members into secretive ceremonies, and reinforced hierarchies that paralleled military and administrative structures. Such practices illustrate the permeability of British religious life to Mediterranean influences and the role of religion in structuring social identity. Military installations were instrumental in the dissemination of Roman religious practices. Soldiers stationed across Britain, recruited from across the empire, carried their own devotional practices, which included the worship of classical gods, emperor veneration, and mystery cult participation. Forts, such as those at Vindolanda and Housesteads, contain altars and inscriptions documenting dedications by soldiers from Gaul, Spain, and the Rhine provinces. These installations served as conduits for religious diversity and cross-cultural exchange, embedding Roman ritual into both military and civilian spheres. Urban centers incorporated temples and shrines into city planning, reflecting both functional and symbolic roles. Forums, civic squares, and marketplaces often neighbored temples, linking economic, administrative, and religious activity. Public ceremonies, processions, and festivals were scheduled to align with imperial anniversaries, seasonal observances, and local adaptations of Roman calendars. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that these civic rituals reinforced social hierarchies, facilitated elite participation, and created public affirmation of Rome's presence in provincial life. Religious institutions also supported social integration and elite status. Civic and military leaders sponsored temple construction, funded ceremonies, and commissioned inscriptions, signaling both piety and political alignment. Inscriptions often commemorate dedications by local magistrates or retired soldiers, indicating the interconnection between religious observance and the projection of authority. Syncretic worship allowed elites to maintain continuity with indigenous belief systems while demonstrating compliance with Roman norms, strengthening local legitimacy within the imperial framework. Coinage and inscriptions played a complementary role in religious integration. Imperial imagery, religious symbols, and commemorative dedications on coins and altars reinforced official ideology, linking monetary circulation with spiritual observance. This dual reinforcement of authority through both material and ritual culture helped stabilize the province, ensuring that provincial populations recognized and participated in the structures of Roman power. Archaeological hoards, combined with temple inscriptions, demonstrate how economic and religious systems functioned as mutually reinforcing mechanisms of governance. Regional variation persisted in religious practice. Southeastern towns, with greater exposure to trade and Roman settlement, display higher densities of temples, altars, and imported cults. Northern and western regions show more limited adoption of Romanized practices, with local and syncretic forms prevailing. Rural shrines and sacred landscapes continued to serve as points of ritual engagement, demonstrating that Roman religious integration accommodated local continuity rather than enforcing uniformity. This regional differentiation reflects pragmatic governance, allowing Rome to assert authority while respecting pre-existing cultural structures. Religious integration also had ideological consequences. Public rituals, festivals, and civic dedications communicated imperial ideology, creating a sense of belonging to a wider Roman world. Participation in these institutions provided avenues for social mobility, elite visibility, and community cohesion. By facilitating the convergence of military, administrative, and religious life, Roman cults strengthened the bonds between provincial subjects and imperial structures, contributing to political stability and cultural negotiation. By the mid-2nd century CE, Roman cults and syncretic practices were firmly established across Britain. Temples, altars, and ritual inscriptions document both imperial presence and the accommodation of indigenous traditions. Syncretic forms, imported mystery religions, and military cults illustrate the diversity of religious life, while urban and rural landscapes reflect the integration of faith into civic, economic, and administrative systems. Religion in Roman Britain thus functioned as a stabilizing mechanism, supporting imperial legitimacy, reinforcing social hierarchies, and mediating cultural interaction. Military presence remained central to enforcing and protecting this system. Forts, roads, and urban centers facilitated oversight, while religious observance reinforced loyalty, discipline, and cohesion among soldiers and civilians alike. Understanding the role of Roman cults and religious syncretism provides essential insight into the processes of provincial integration, cultural negotiation, and the interplay between ideology and governance that defined Roman Britain. Roman authority advanced unevenly beyond southeastern Britain. After the consolidation of control in the southeast and establishment of urban and administrative networks, military campaigns extended into Wales and the Northern Territories. The province's mountainous terrain, fragmented tribal networks, and resilient local populations presented persistent challenges to Roman forces. The campaigns against the Silures, Ordovices, and other tribes demonstrate the combination of military adaptation, strategic fortification, and logistical coordination required to expand imperial authority into less accessible regions. Evidence from Tacitus and archaeological surveys of forts provides the primary basis for reconstructing these campaigns. The Silures of southeast Wales were particularly noted for their sustained resistance. Tacitus records that the proconsul Ostorius Scapula led repeated expeditions to suppress uprisings, yet the hilly terrain and localized tribal organization slowed Roman progress. Archaeological investigation reveals a series of temporary marching camps and permanent forts, such as those at Isca, modern Caerleon, and Bremia, that reflect both strategic occupation and long-term pacification efforts. These installations served multiple functions, from troop quarters and supply depots to observation posts controlling local movement. Campaigns in northern Wales, directed against the Ordovices and other tribes, further illustrate Rome's adaptive military strategy. Roman forces utilized coordinated movements along rivers and mountain passes to engage dispersed tribal groups, minimizing exposure to ambush and maximizing logistical efficiency. Fort placement was guided by access to supply lines, defensible terrain, and proximity to key tribal centers. Archaeologists have identified fort layouts, ditches, and watchtowers that reflect standard Roman military engineering, adapted to the constraints of rugged landscapes. The structure of military logistics was critical to sustaining these campaigns. Legions relied on a combination of local foraging, supply from southeastern bases, and establishment of granaries and storage facilities at fort sites. Road construction, while less extensive than in the lowlands, connected strategic locations and facilitated the movement of troops, provisions, and equipment. Excavations of temporary camps demonstrate careful attention to water access, defensibility, and rapid assembly, illustrating the systematic approach employed to maintain operational readiness in challenging terrain. The campaigns were often prolonged rather than decisively concluded through singular battles. Tacitus emphasizes the persistence and resilience of local resistance, indicating that Roman forces engaged in repeated expeditions to pacify regions, often returning to secure supply routes and fortifications before advancing further. This pattern of extended pressure, rather than quick conquest, underscores the adaptive nature of Roman military strategy in difficult provincial contexts. The combination of incremental military operations, fortified settlements, and administrative oversight enabled the gradual incorporation of these territories into the provincial framework. Strategic fort placement facilitated both defense and offense. Permanent forts at Isca, Deva, Chester, and Saguntium, Caernarvon, anchored Roman control, while auxiliary forts and watchtowers monitored movement through valleys and passes. The standardization of fort design, rectangular layouts, defensive ditches, ramparts, and gates allowed rapid construction and consistent functionality across diverse topographies. Archaeological surveys indicate that fort distribution was carefully planned to cover tribal centers, resource zones, and key transportation routes, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of regional geography in military planning. The Roman approach combined direct military engagement with indirect control. In regions where persistent resistance prevented total occupation, Rome relied on alliances with cooperative tribes, negotiated settlements, and garrison oversight. Inscriptions and material evidence indicate that auxiliary cohorts recruited locally were stationed at forts, integrating indigenous soldiers into the imperial system while leveraging local knowledge for operational advantage. These arrangements reinforced Roman authority without necessitating continuous full-scale campaigns across every territory. Economic and administrative considerations shaped military expansion. Forts not only served as defensive positions but also facilitated collection of tribute, regulation of local production, and control of resource extraction. Surveyed granaries and storage pits indicate that forts supported both military personnel and the redistribution of agricultural and mineral resources. Roads connecting forts to urban centers and coastal ports allowed supplies, coinage, and administrative directives to circulate efficiently, linking military action with broader provincial governance. The cumulative effect of these campaigns was gradual pacification and integration rather than immediate subjugation. Archaeological stratigraphy indicates periods of occupation, rebuilding, and adaptation at fort sites, reflecting ongoing military presence and the necessity of long-term stabilization. The Roman strategy relied on combining physical infrastructure with political accommodation, ensuring that territories could eventually be incorporated into the provincial administration and economy. Tribal resistance persisted alongside these advances. Tacitus notes sporadic uprisings, raids, and challenges to Roman authority, highlighting the difficulty of maintaining control in regions characterized by fragmented social organization and challenging geography. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts, showing destruction layers, temporary fortifications, and signs of intermittent conflict. The pattern of repeated engagement and fort reinforcement demonstrates Rome's recognition that conquest in Wales and northern Britain required sustained commitment and adaptive strategy. The campaigns also illustrate the interplay between military, logistical, and administrative planning. Military presence enabled taxation, law enforcement, and infrastructure development, while roads, forts, and supply networks reinforced operational capacity. Forts became administrative hubs, hosting magistrates, supply officers, and military engineers. This integration ensured that strategic objectives, security, resource management, and provincial consolidation were achieved concurrently. By the end of the late 1st century CE, Wales and northern Britain were partially pacified and gradually incorporated into the provincial framework. Fort networks, road systems, and allied tribal settlements stabilized the region, enabling Rome to maintain presence without requiring continuous large-scale campaigning. These territories remained more volatile than the southeast, but the combination of adaptive military strategy, infrastructure, and administrative oversight established the template for provincial control in frontier zones. Persistent resistance led Rome to redefine its northern limits. While campaigns in Wales and northern Britain extended authority, logistical constraints and ongoing tribal opposition necessitated the establishment of defensive boundaries rather than indefinite expansion. These experiences informed subsequent frontier policies, influencing the placement of forts, roads, and provincial governance structures in regions further north, including the lowlands of modern Scotland. The campaigns underscore that Roman control was contingent on strategic occupation, local negotiation, and the creation of sustainable logistical networks. Rome chose consolidation over expansion in northern Britain. By the early 2nd century CE, imperial authorities recognized that indefinite expansion into the northern highlands was logistically unsustainable. In response, Emperor Hadrian ordered the construction of a fortified frontier stretching across the width of northern Britain. Far from being a mere defensive barrier, Hadrian's Wall functioned as a complex military, administrative, and economic system designed to regulate movement, control trade, and sustain a permanent military presence. Archaeological evidence demonstrates the wall's multifaceted role. The structure comprised a continuous stone and turf barrier, punctuated by mile castles, turrets, and larger forts at strategic intervals. Mile castles, spaced approximately every Roman mile, housed small garrisons responsible for monitoring crossings and enforcing local regulations. Larger forts, such as Vindolanda, Housesteads, and Bertelswald, accommodated cohorts and auxiliary units, serving as both logistical hubs and administrative centers. Excavated granaries, barracks, and workshops indicate that these installations were capable of sustaining long-term occupation and supporting complex operational needs. The placement of forts and mile castles was dictated by topography, access routes, and proximity to tribal settlements. Military engineers selected locations to maximize surveillance, enable rapid deployment, and ensure secure supply lines. Inscriptions and building records provide insight into the organization of labor and resources, documenting the contributions of both legionary engineers and local contractors. Evidence of timber scaffolding, stone masonry, and defensive ditches illustrates the combination of standardized Roman engineering and adaptation to the local environment. Hadrian's Wall also functioned as an instrument of economic and administrative control. Gates controlled crossing points and watchtowers regulated trade, migration, and taxation. Archaeological finds, including amphorae, metalwork, and imported pottery, suggest that the frontier facilitated regulated commercial activity rather than merely obstructing movement. Coin hoards and inscriptions associated with forts provide evidence for monetized transactions, official toll collection, and logistical accounting, indicating that the wall's operation extended beyond military functions into governance and provincial oversight. Troop deployment along the frontier exemplifies the integration of military and administrative strategy. Legions and auxiliary units were assigned specific sectors, alternating between permanent occupation and rotational duty. Excavations of barracks, training grounds, and supply depots indicate systematic management of personnel, rations, and equipment. Inscriptions record the units stationed at individual forts, their commanding officers, and sometimes the emperor responsible for construction, providing precise documentation of operational organization. This structured deployment allowed Rome to maintain control over a volatile frontier with comparatively limited forces. Logistical networks supported the wall's functionality. Supply routes connected northern forts to urban centers in the Midlands and Southeast, ensuring steady delivery of grain, building materials, and equipment. Roads linking forts, turrets, and mile castles facilitated troop movement and rapid response to incursions. Archaeological evidence from temporary camps and storage facilities highlights the efficiency of provisioning systems, demonstrating that frontier stability depended on coordinated military, economic, and administrative infrastructure rather than purely defensive measures. Hadrian's Wall also imposed administrative order on the surrounding regions. Tribal territories north and south of the wall were monitored, controlled, and in some cases partially integrated through diplomatic arrangements. Forts served as centers for communication with local communities, recording tribute, overseeing local production, and enforcing Roman law. Inscriptions and official records indicate that garrisons maintained detailed accounts, reinforcing the role of the wall as a mechanism of governance as well as a military barrier. Cultural integration occurred alongside military consolidation. Auxiliary troops recruited from across the empire, Gaul, Spain, the Rhine provinces, and beyond, brought diverse religious practices, material culture, and technical knowledge. Artifacts including altars, inscriptions, and domestic items illustrate the multicultural character of frontier life. The wall, while physically imposing, also functioned as a site of social interaction, cultural negotiation, and administrative standardization, demonstrating that Rome's frontier strategy combined coercion with institutional integration. Hadrian's Wall exemplifies a shift in imperial strategy from territorial expansion to controlled management. Its construction reflects a recognition of logistical limits, the need for sustainable occupation, and the importance of integrating military, economic, and administrative systems. Archaeological stratigraphy indicates sequential building phases, repairs, and adaptations, suggesting ongoing evaluation and optimization by Roman engineers. The frontier was not static but evolved to meet operational and political demands over decades. The system of mile castles, forts, and turrets ensured that control was exercised at multiple scales. Small garrisons monitored daily movement, while larger forts coordinated regional operations. Roads, supply chains, and surveillance mechanisms reinforced this hierarchy, allowing commanders to respond efficiently to threats, enforce taxation, and regulate cross-frontier trade. Material culture from the wall, including weaponry, tools, ceramics, and coins, demonstrates the simultaneous functioning of military, economic, and social networks, highlighting the wall's role as a living instrument of imperial policy. Hadrian's Wall also contributed to frontier security through deterrence rather than constant combat. The visible presence of fortifications, patrols, and towers signaled Roman authority, discouraging raids and fostering compliance among nearby communities. Archaeological evidence indicates that while some attacks occurred, large-scale incursions were rare, suggesting that the wall's administrative and psychological functions were as important as its defensive capacity. By maintaining a controlled frontier, Rome created conditions for economic stability and provincial integration. Markets, trade routes, and local production could operate with reduced threat of disruption, supporting urban centers and military provisioning. Inscriptions indicate continued investment in construction and maintenance, while the presence of artisans and support personnel reflects the broader social and economic ecosystem anchored by the wall. The frontier thus facilitated not only defense but also governance, commerce, and social organization. The construction and operation of Hadrian's Wall reinforced imperial authority while accommodating local realities. Military discipline, administrative oversight, and economic regulation were integrated into a single operational system. Strategic placement, infrastructure, and logistic management enabled sustained control over a challenging frontier environment. The wall exemplifies how Rome balanced consolidation with operational efficiency, ensuring that northern Britain could be defended, administered, and economically integrated without excessive strain on imperial resources. Stabilized frontiers enabled a period of relative prosperity. The controlled security of the northern boundary allowed urban centers, villa estates, and trade networks in the Midlands and South to flourish. Roads facilitated commerce, Ports managed imports, and frontier forts provided predictable conditions for economic exchange. In this context, Hadrian's Wall was more than a line of stone. It was a structural framework for provincial administration, military organization, and economic coordination, embodying Rome's strategic choice to consolidate rather than expand. Roman Britain reached its greatest stability under imperial consolidation. By the 2nd century CE, the province had transitioned from frontier conquest to organized governance, characterized by administrative efficiency, economic integration, and urban development. Imperial oversight, standardized legal procedures, and structured taxation enabled provincial authorities to maintain predictable social order. Urban centers, villa estates, and military installations functioned within a coordinated framework, providing the infrastructure necessary for sustained economic growth and political stability. Urban expansion reflects the province's administrative maturity. Towns such as Londinium, Verulamium, Camulogenum, and Glevum developed into fully structured urban environments with forums, basilicas, baths, and market precincts. Archaeological evidence from street layouts, drainage systems, and civic buildings demonstrates deliberate urban planning designed to accommodate administration, commerce, and social interaction. Civic institutions, including local councils, curiae, and magistracies, exercised municipal authority under imperial supervision, ensuring that towns operated in alignment with provincial regulations. Villa estates illustrate the economic foundations of stability. Estates expanded across fertile regions, particularly in southeastern and central Britain, producing surplus crops, livestock, and processed goods for local consumption and provincial redistribution. Excavations at sites such as Chedworth, Fishbourne, and Lullingstone reveal organized field systems, granaries, and workshops, reflecting integration with taxation networks and supply for urban populations and military garrisons. These estates exemplify how private agricultural production supported broader provincial governance and contributed to urban prosperity. Coin circulation provides additional evidence of economic maturity. Numismatic studies indicate a steady influx of imperial coinage, facilitating taxation, trade, and wage payments for both civilians and the military. Coin hoards and minting records suggest public confidence in monetary systems, reflecting both economic stability and administrative oversight. The regular use of currency allowed provincial authorities to collect taxes efficiently, redistribute wealth, and maintain the financial mechanisms necessary for provincial governance. Infrastructure continued to consolidate the province's integration. Roads connected urban centers, villas, military forts, and ports, enabling the movement of goods, personnel, and information. Bridges, drainage systems, and paved streets demonstrate attention to long-term maintenance, while archaeological finds of milestones and inscriptions record imperial investment in connectivity. These systems facilitated economic exchange, legal oversight, and military readiness, ensuring that provincial stability was reinforced across spatial and functional scales. The military remained a central component of provincial administration, though its role shifted from conquest to maintenance and deterrence. Forts along Hadrian's Wall, coastal installations, and inland garrisons ensured the security of towns, trade routes, and villa estates. Auxiliary cohorts stationed at key locations served both military and administrative functions, monitoring local populations, supervising resource extraction, and coordinating logistical operations. This integration of military and civil administration contributed to the province's capacity for sustained governance. Provincial governance extended beyond the purely administrative to the regulation of social and civic life. Legal frameworks codified property rights, commercial transactions, and local dispute resolution. Magistrates and councils adjudicated cases in alignment with imperial law, ensuring consistent enforcement and legitimacy. Inscriptions and tablets from towns and villas provide documentary evidence of contracts, tax obligations, and civic sponsorship, illustrating the procedural sophistication of provincial administration. Trade networks, both internal and external, underpinned economic maturity. Goods produced on villa estates moved through markets in towns, ports, and roadside settlements, reaching both local and international destinations. Imported products, including wine amphorae, ceramics, and luxury items, demonstrate sustained connections with Gaul, the Rhineland, and the Mediterranean. Archaeological finds indicate that trade facilitated not only material exchange but also the transmission of ideas, cultural norms, and technological innovations, embedding Britain firmly within imperial economic circuits. Agricultural specialization complemented urban demand. Southeastern estates focused on grain production and horticulture, supplying urban populations and contributing to military provisioning. Western and northern estates emphasized pastoralism, with surplus livestock processed locally or transported to administrative centers. Archaeological studies of storage facilities, farm tools, and production infrastructure illustrate how estates adapted to regional conditions while contributing to the province-wide system. This specialization enhanced efficiency, ensured stability, and reduced vulnerability to localized disruption. Civic life reflected administrative and economic integration. Markets, public baths, and entertainment structures reinforced social hierarchies and communal cohesion. Religious institutions, including temples to classical deities and syncretic local gods, were embedded within urban planning, linking ritual, governance, and social participation. Inscriptions, altars, and votive offerings indicate active community engagement, while public monuments and dedications demonstrate the involvement of both elite and civic actors in sustaining provincial identity. Urban and rural populations interacted through coordinated economic and administrative mechanisms. Roads, granaries, and markets facilitated the redistribution of resources, allowing towns to access rural production while supporting military needs. Villa estates contributed labor, surplus goods, and tax revenues, reinforcing the province's financial and logistical capacity. Archaeological evidence shows that this interdependence created a network system in which both urban and rural components functioned to maintain provincial stability. Environmental and geographic factors continued to influence administration. Southeastern lowlands, with fertile soils and accessible rivers, supported intensive agriculture and urban concentration. Western and northern highlands, less conducive to large-scale cultivation, retained a degree of autonomous settlement and localized governance, though fort networks and roads extended Roman oversight. The province's administration adapted to these geographic constraints, demonstrating the empire's capacity for flexible governance across diverse landscapes. Economic confidence underpinned cultural and social development. Towns invested in public architecture, villas displayed refined domestic decoration, and trade facilitated access to imported luxury goods. Inscriptions and archaeological deposits document patronage, civic participation, and commercial activity, indicating a level of prosperity that supported both elite and communal interests. Coin hoards, storage facilities, and imported artifacts reflect sustained economic stability and provincial integration. By the early 3rd century CE, Roman Britain exhibited a fully operational provincial system. Administrative efficiency, economic maturity, and coordinated infrastructure enabled urban growth, agricultural productivity, and social cohesion. Roads, forts, towns, and estates functioned together to provide security, governance, and economic stability. The province was not only militarily secure but also economically resilient, culturally integrated, and administratively coherent, representing a peak in Roman provincial development. However, stability depended on broader imperial conditions. Fluctuations in central authority, military reassignments, and economic pressures from other provinces had the potential to affect local governance and security. The systems established in Britain were robust but interconnected with the wider empire, illustrating that provincial prosperity was contingent upon sustained imperial support, strategic oversight, and effective administration. This interdependence foreshadows both the endurance and eventual challenges of Roman Britain in the centuries to follow. Prosperity was not evenly distributed across the province. While southeastern towns, villa estates, and fortified settlements exhibited economic maturity and urban development, other regions of Britain experienced more limited integration into Roman administrative and economic systems. Archaeological evidence from settlement patterns, housing structures, and material culture demonstrates that wealth, Infrastructure and social complexity varied significantly across the province, reflecting both geographic constraints and the uneven reach of imperial authority. Urban centers in southeastern Britain, including Londinium, Verulamium, and Camulogenum, display clear evidence of social stratification. Excavations reveal multi-tiered housing, with elite residences featuring hypo-cost heating, mosaics, and imported furnishings, contrasted with modest townhouses and insulae occupied by artisans, merchants, and laborers. Civic inscriptions, funerary monuments, and coinage attest to elite involvement in municipal administration, commerce, and public benefaction, indicating both social visibility and institutional influence. These urban elites played a critical role in mediating Roman authority, maintaining civic order, and supporting provincial infrastructure. In contrast, western and northern regions, including Wales, the Pennines, and Northern Highlands, exhibit more modest development. Villa estates were fewer, urban centers smaller, and imported material culture less prevalent. Archaeological surveys of rural settlements indicate continued reliance on subsistence agriculture, localized trade, and small-scale craft production. While military forts provided some infrastructural and economic stimuli, civilian settlements in these areas often lacked the density, connectivity, and wealth evident in the southeast, highlighting the limits of Roman integration and the persistence of pre-Roman social structures. Military installations influenced social hierarchies and civilian-military relations across the province. Forts, watchtowers, and roads served as centers of authority and economic activity. Soldiers, drawn from diverse regions of the empire, occupied a socially distinct status, with privileges including regular pay, land grants upon retirement, and access to urban and religious networks. Civilian populations adjacent to forts, merchants, craftsmen, and farmers, interacted economically and socially with the military, benefiting from demand for supplies, trade, and services. This relationship created localized social stratification, where proximity to military infrastructure translated into access to resources and status. Regional variation also reflected geographic and environmental factors. Fertile lowlands supported productive villa estates, which generated surplus for trade and urban provisioning. Conversely, uplands, forested areas, and remote regions constrained agricultural productivity, settlement density, and infrastructure development. Archaeological evidence, including field systems, storage facilities, and settlement distribution, indicates that Roman administration adapted to these geographic realities by concentrating investment where it was most sustainable, leaving peripheral regions less economically integrated. Material culture provides additional insight into social differentiation. Luxury imports, Mediterranean amphory, fine ceramics, and glassware appear predominantly in urban centers and villa estates, signaling elite consumption patterns. In contrast, rural settlements often contain locally produced wares, simpler domestic implements, and evidence of continued indigenous craft traditions. These patterns illustrate that Romanization was neither uniform nor total, with elite culture concentrated in select areas and local practices persisting alongside imperial influence. Funerary practices also reveal social hierarchy and regional disparity. Monumental tombs, inscriptions, and commemorative statuary in urban and affluent villa contexts reflect wealth, status, and public recognition. In contrast, modest burials in peripheral settlements and military-adjacent villages suggest lower social visibility and limited access to monumental culture. Archaeological examination of burial goods, epigraphic evidence, and cemetery organization underscores the intersection of social class, regional variation, and integration into Roman civic structures. Economic stratification was reinforced through taxation and land tenure systems. Villa owners, urban elites, and landholders contributed proportionally to provincial revenues, while smaller farmers and rural inhabitants often experienced heavier relative obligations due to limited productive capacity. Archaeological and documentary evidence from tax records, inscriptions, and estate layouts indicates that wealth accumulation concentrated among elites with direct access to urban markets and administrative networks, further entrenching social divisions. Religious and cultural life reflected stratified social structures. Elite participation in public rituals, temple sponsorship, and syncretic cults reinforced status and facilitated political visibility. Military garrisons, while socially distinct, also influenced local religious practice through their own ceremonies and cults, contributing to cultural pluralism. Rural populations continued to practice localized traditions, often integrated with Romanized religious frameworks, highlighting both adaptation and continuity across social strata. Urban-rural interactions shaped regional economies and social opportunity. Towns depended on rural estates for agricultural products, raw materials, and labor, while rural producers relied on markets, ports, and urban demand. Archaeological evidence of road networks, granaries, and marketplaces demonstrates the material infrastructure supporting this interdependence. However, geographic distance and limited connectivity meant that benefits were unevenly distributed, with central towns and their immediate surroundings accruing the greatest economic advantage. These disparities created uneven access to political influence and social mobility. Elite families in prosperous towns could participate in municipal councils, sponsor public works, and gain recognition within the provincial hierarchy. Conversely, residents of peripheral settlements had limited visibility and fewer mechanisms for upward mobility. Military service provided one alternative avenue for social advancement, particularly for local recruits integrated into auxiliary units. Such pathways illustrate how regional and class differences structured opportunities within Roman Britain. Education, literacy, and administrative skill also mirrored social stratification. Urban elites engaged in formal training, Latin literacy, and administrative functions necessary for participation in governance and commerce. Rural populations exhibited lower literacy rates and limited exposure to administrative frameworks, though inscriptions, graffiti, and occasional written records indicate some diffusion of literacy and Roman cultural norms. These distinctions reinforced class hierarchies while facilitating provincial administration in areas where elite intermediaries exercised authority on behalf of Rome. Social disparities were further highlighted during periods of economic stress or military threat. Peripheral regions with less infrastructure and limited resources were more vulnerable to disruption, while well-integrated towns and villa estates demonstrated resilience due to diversified production, trade links, and administrative support. Archaeological evidence of repair layers, emergency fortifications, and adjustments to settlement patterns illustrates how regional inequalities influenced both vulnerability and capacity for recovery. By examining settlement patterns, material culture, and military-civilian interactions, it is evident that Romanization in Britain was partial and uneven. Elite influence, urban prosperity, and villa productivity coexisted with areas of limited integration and persistent indigenous practices. Social stratification was reinforced by wealth, geographic location, military association, and administrative involvement, producing a complex provincial landscape in which access to resources, status, and opportunity varied considerably. These disparities became vulnerabilities during imperial crisis. Peripheral regions, less economically and administratively integrated, were more exposed to disruption from external threats or imperial instability. Elite concentration in urban centers meant that sudden shifts in governance, taxation, or military deployment could disproportionately affect peripheral populations. Understanding the uneven distribution of prosperity, authority, and infrastructure provides essential context for analyzing subsequent challenges faced by Roman Britain in the late 3rd and 4th centuries CE. Roman Britain did not disappear in 410 CE. The formal withdrawal of imperial authority marked the end of centralized administration, yet numerous Roman institutions and infrastructures persisted, shaping post-Roman society. Roads, urban layouts, and architectural frameworks continued to guide settlement and communication patterns. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that major towns such as Londinium, Verulamium, and York retained structural organization, street grids, and public buildings, even as centralized governance waned. The Roman road network exemplifies enduring institutional influence. Routes such as Watling Street, Ermine Street, and Deer Street remained primary corridors for movement, trade, and communication. Subsequent settlements and early medieval centers often emerged along these routes, demonstrating continuity in spatial organization. Archaeological surveys reveal that roads, bridges, and causeways were maintained locally, preserving the logistical framework established under Roman administration. This infrastructural persistence facilitated trade, military movement, and administrative coordination long after the legions departed. Urban and rural settlements show evidence of both continuity and adaptation. Many towns retained elements of Roman architecture, including forums, basilicas, and bath complexes, though usage shifted toward local civic and economic functions. Villa estates, while declining in scale, continued to serve as focal points for agriculture, craft production, and regional leadership. Excavations at sites such as Chedworth and Lullingstone indicate continued habitation, reorganization of domestic spaces, and gradual integration with emerging post-Roman socio-political structures. Legal and administrative concepts also exhibited post-Roman influence. Although formal Roman governance ended, evidence from charters, inscriptions, and early medieval administrative records suggests that Roman law, land tenure practices, and civic protocols informed successor systems. Land boundaries, taxation precedents, and local governance structures retained elements of Roman organization, demonstrating that institutional knowledge persisted through continuity in both material and conceptual frameworks. Military infrastructure contributed to post-Roman resilience. Forts along Hadrian's Wall, coastal installations, and inland defenses, though no longer staffed by imperial troops, provided shelter, strategic reference points, and centers for local authority. Archaeological investigation reveals repurposing of stone and timber, adaptation for local defense, and continued use as loci of social organization. These structures served as a bridge between Roman strategic planning and emerging regional powers. Material culture further illustrates institutional survival. Pottery, coins, and building techniques show continuity and adaptation in post-Roman contexts. Imported goods declined, yet local production drew upon Roman technical knowledge, maintaining standardized construction methods, masonry skills, and agricultural practices. Inscriptions, altars, and reused monuments indicate that cultural memory persisted, integrating Roman identity into evolving local traditions. Archaeological continuity challenges narratives of sudden collapse. Rather than a complete cessation of administration or urban life, evidence points to a gradual transformation. Local elites, often emerging from the former Romanized population, assumed responsibility for civic coordination, economic management, and territorial oversight. This adaptation maintained essential functions, providing continuity in communication, production, and governance despite the absence of imperial oversight. Religious structures also illustrate institutional persistence. Temples, shrines, and Christian sites founded during the late Roman period continued in use or were repurposed in post-Roman communities. Architectural layouts, ritual practices, and associated material culture reflect continuity in social and spiritual organization. These structures contributed to the shaping of early medieval cultural and political landscapes, bridging Roman and post-Roman experiences. The archaeological record demonstrates that Roman Britain's legacy extended beyond tangible structures. Roads guided settlement, forts influenced defensive strategies, villas shaped agricultural organization, and urban layouts informed civic planning. Material culture, legal practices, and architectural knowledge were transmitted, providing a foundation for subsequent societies. This persistence underscores that the end of Roman rule represented transformation rather than abrupt collapse. In conclusion, the institutional and material legacy of Roman Britain illustrates the enduring influence of Roman administration, infrastructure, and cultural practices. Roads, settlements, military sites, and legal frameworks persisted, facilitating the continuity of economic, social, and political structures. Archaeological and textual evidence encourages a reassessment of traditional collapse narratives, emphasizing continuity, adaptation, and transformation. Roman Britain, though formally integrated into the empire no longer, continued to shape the social, economic, and spatial organization of post-Roman Britain, leaving a legacy observable for centuries. Before we conclude, make sure to subscribe to Nightfall History for daily in-depth explorations of civilizations and empires. Click the bell icon to receive notifications for each new documentary, and share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Roman Britain fascinated you the most? Your engagement helps us continue bringing precise, research-driven history straight to your screen.